Hey everyone, Harry here to talk about the actual legal issues surrounding the abduction of President Maduro of Venezuela. We've done a separate YouTube talking about the very unusual arraignment that took place this morning in the Southern District of New York. And now I want to give you the law of the actual abduction. But point number one is that these different legal issues and even the political issues that both of them engender are now completely connected and tied up with one another. The politics here is the law and the law is the politics, but the law in isolation. The number one point that I emphasize in the Substack, and I think by and large the coverage has now tumbled to, this is based on the United States proffered justification, a straightforward domestic law enforcement matter. There is a memo. It was written in 1989, around the time of the capture of Manuel Noriega, that asserts this authority, and the same memo is being relied on now, and it does not depend on any sort of international consequences or law of war and the like. Recall that until this point, when we were bombing ships in international waters off the Caribbean, there was a fairly tortured analysis, and that still might have some relevance, even though the contemporary events in Venezuela are now completely subsumed by what's happened with Maduro. But we tried these various ways to say the drugs are actually weapons of war and they're being used not by Venezuela at the time, but by a terrorist group, Tren de Aragua, to make war on us, etc. Very, very tenuous, and I would say as I wrote back then, bogus. It doesn't fly. Here, however, the memo from Bill Barr that they're relying on basically says somebody commits serious crimes against the United States, and Maduro was indicted in 2020. It's now been superseded, basically saying, as we said with Noriega, as we said with other people, including El Chapo, he is facilitating or conspiring with others to run this big drug ring that is flooding the United States with cocaine. That's against the law. Quick aside here, the exact theory that resulted in the 45-year sentence for the former president of Honduras, whom Trump proceeded to pardon when he'd barely begun to serve his long sentence. So that is also a factor here on the political side of things. But that is the supposed authority. And just to spell out a little bit more what's in the Barr memo, it is clear that international law prohibits this abduction. Let me say it again. It is clear that international law prohibits this abduction, a very core provision of United Nations law to which the United States has subscribed, as there are many that it hasn't subscribed to, but both it and Venezuela have. Article 2.4 says you can't just go and grab the president or a high official of another state, as you can imagine. And the Barr memo doesn't try to get around that. Rather, it says you can ignore it when it's an issue of application of your own domestic law. Doesn't mean you should, but you can. And now Trump has decided both that you can and you should. Why can you? Because we have signed on to this provision that makes it a treaty. And Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, says that the laws of the land, the Constitution, federal law, and treaties are supreme, meaning they apply. This has the treaty that we subscribe to, the same force and primacy as the Constitution itself and as federal criminal law that Maduro has been charged under. Well, Barr's theory is that there's no way of getting a judicial right of review for the United Nations theory that we've signed off on. There's no way to bring it in court and say, well, you can't do this because of the treaty. That's a standing issue, however, and it really is, I think, a flagrant non sequitur at the heart of the memo that the United States is depending on here, and I am far from alone in saying it. In fact, and this is really illuminating, the department itself never has tried to assert the bona fides of this legal opinion from 1989 from Bill Barr in any court at all. But the notion is because you can't bring a case under 2.4, and the United States can bring a criminal case, that the criminal case trumps and there's no impediment posed by the treaty. That is just, on a brief examination, a non sequitur. It doesn't mean whether or not somebody could bring a cause of action that the president isn't obligated to follow the law, the international law that the United States has subscribed to. And indeed, the memo has been really discredited and repudiated, not officially withdrawn, but it is a very, even leaving aside its flawed logic, its sort of provenance and the respect it's accorded in the community is very, very suspect already. So it was, for that reason alone, a very tenuous source of authority. But that is what Trump is going with. So again, it's just the straightforward, same as El Chapo, the guy broke domestic law. Seriously, imagine that someone had murdered someone and we just go in and snatch that person. There are circumstances where you can do it. And moreover, as I said in the other memo, even if you are snatched illegally under international or domestic law, that you can't bring that up as a defense once you're in front of a court in the United States. It's just a doctrine by the Supreme Court saying that there's no so-called fruit of the poisonous tree. Even if you're illegally snatched or abducted, it doesn't give you a claim to dismiss the criminal charges. So we have the United States first disavowing, not in any way depending on international law, and indeed implicitly saying we can violate international law if we feel like it. And then going on the basis of the criminal code. However, the criminal charges, I said you could analogize this to, say, El Chapo or Noriega, except there's a very important potential difference, which is the common law doctrine that the Supreme Court has accepted, saying you may not bring charges like this against a head of state. And I talked about this some in the other YouTube, and I think that's worth checking out, where I also go through the arraignment, and I talk about it as well in the Substack we published this morning. But basically, there's going to be a big battle joined. It already was announced at the arraignment, where Maduro's lawyer is going to try to say he's the head of state and the charges have to be thrown out for that reason. And the United States is going to try to argue he isn't really. Whatever title he has, he's not the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. It's not a democracy, and it's a little ironic for the U.S. government under Trump to say, but he basically stole an election, did in 2018 what Trump was not able to do in 2020, 2021. So he's not a real head of state. And if they can make that argument successfully, then the criminal track just proceeds. He'll have plenty of arguments to make, but they're going to be time consuming, and basically I think Maduro and his wife will just remain in jail while they're made, and the whole thing won't come to trial, if it does at all, for a few years even, while this all the Sturm und Drang, and there is plenty, plays out in the political sphere, in particular, if Congress finds its spine and just demands, as it has a right to, some information about just what's gone down and how is it that we came in and for what reason, because the reasons have been regularly shifting from fentanyl to cocaine to regime change, where is oil, and now just to he broke domestic law. So examine the reasons that this has happened, the upshot of it, where it leaves us, and then this whole situation where we apparently want to run Venezuela, at least temporarily, though there's some daylight, it seems, between Trump and Marco Rubio here. But the big mess that, unsurprisingly, it follows in the wake of this kind of abduction and has in the past anyway transformed what seemed like a mission accomplished moment of patriotism into an ongoing mess with resentment from the people we've left behind and all kinds of obligations to the United States. And what about the oil and the oil property? So that's the mess ahead. But the mess in court is the straightforward drug allegations and our assertion that's going to be hard to challenge in court, even if it's wrong legally, that you can just snatch someone and bring them to American justice, which is the way that Pam Bondi put it. And that other than this head of state issue, which is a big asterisk here, that is now the Maduro case on a regular track and on the theory that the United States will vigorously assert that Maduro is not a bona fide head of state. And if they do it successfully, we're just basically on a normal, although big, criminal law track for what would be a very large drug conspiracy. Then Maduro will combat at every turn and with ingenious motions and the like, and will take a while, but he will not be able to challenge the actual abduction in the context of the